This is another episode of Standup Comedy, your host and MC, celebrating 40-plus years on the fringe of show business. Stories, interviews, and comedy sets from the famous and not so famous. Here's your host and MC, Scott Edwards.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the podcast, and we have another special audience of one, and we're in for a treat. You've heard him before, one of our favorite regulars. He was one of the stars of the Bob and Tom radio show. What he's most famous for is his series called Vague But True. Ladies and gentlemen, it's Tim Bedore.
Here he is, a philosopher, a writer, a comedian, a man who can fool a lie detector but chooses not to, the host of Vague But True, Tim Bedore. Well, thank you very much. I'm a life coach now, and lots of people ask me for advice on cremation. Well, okay, one person asked me for advice on cremation because they were concerned about getting into heaven if they were cremated and didn't have a body, a dead body, but still have a body that could be reanimated, I guess, to walk through the pearly gates. A lot of people believe that. And those concerns brought me back to my own parents and what they wanted done upon their deaths. My mom wanted burial. My dad wanted to be cremated. And my mom wanted us to tell my dad that we would have him cremated, but not do it. My mom, behind my dad's back, lobbied my brothers and I to lie to my dad. My wife is a lawyer, and she said the dead rarely sue, so we could get away with it. But it was an odd spot to be in. My mom was worried that you can't get into heaven without a body, that cremation was against the will of God. And if my dad went first, was cremated, thus not in heaven because, you can't escort a pile of ashes into the pearly gates. If that was the case, when she died, she wouldn't know anybody up there or be without her husband, and old boyfriends might be hitting on her. She worried about this kind of stuff. That's my mom in a nutshell. My dad was very opposed to being buried, taking up space, expensive caskets. He thought it was all silly and not God's will at all. And it's not even your body that goes into heaven if there is a heaven. And he was very intent that his ashes be spread in the sand dunes above Saugatuck, Michigan. My dad had never been to Saugatuck, but he always heard it was a nice place. Just kidding. He spent idyllic summers in Saugatuck when he was a kid, and that's where he wanted his ashes spread. So that was his thought. But I remember worrying that if my dad died first, my mom was going to be an emotional wreck already, and because she thought my dad was a saint, he should be interred at the Vatican or buried with military honors at Arlington National Cemetery, even though the closest my dad got to seeing combat in World War II is when he was guarding a plane in Texas and a cow stepped on his foot. Why a cow decided to attack that plane in Texas, they were never certain, but my dad held him off, and according to my mom, turned the tide of the war. Anyway, I never predicted, I'd have to wonder, if St. Peter would ever usher a pile of ashes into heaven to sit at the right hand of God the Father Almighty, but suddenly I had to, and that got me thinking, if there is a heaven, and those that go to heaven sit at the right hand of God the Father, what's off on the left side?
Generally, you should never
handball
lie to
courts?
your wife,
what is he doing on the left? Lawn bowling? That didn't help the discussion, but that's kind of my role in the family. Anyway, the most vexing issue for me was, what if we're all out there in the sand dunes? This is the big moment. We're going to disperse my dad's ashes. My mom is muttering about we should be at the Vatican or Arlington, but we're out here in the sand dunes, and there is no wind. And I open the urn, fling out the ashes, and Dad plops out onto the sand and lands on a Butterfinger wrapper or something out there. What do you do then? Pick up the Butterfinger wrapper and put it in the trash? Say goodbye to Dad, head to the beach and go swimming? None of this seemed right. Although my dad loved candy and the beach, so maybe it would be all right. But I think it would freak my mom out. And with her fake hips struggling through the sand dunes, this is all not a good idea. So this is what I told my client. Cremation is fine, but hang on to the ashes. Why? I saw this on the evening news. An older woman, widow, just lost her house in a flash fire, gas explosion, had seconds to get out, and she told the TV news guy, she grabbed the one thing that was most meaningful in the house, the urn with her husband's ashes. And she told the TV news guy, as long as she had that urn, she was okay, she could rebuild. And I thought, wow, that's the kind of lifelong love we should all strive for. And what a comfort for her to have those ashes nearby. And then I thought, the ashes were the only thing in the house that would have survived the fire intact. I would have taken the TV. That's what I would have done. I would have yelled to my wife's urn, honey, fire's done all the damage it can do to you at this point in your life, and this is a new 4K LED screen I got with your life insurance payout. Gotta run. Anyway, I take my responsibilities as a life coach seriously, so I told my client, if they're going to distribute anyone's remains, to bring an air rifle or leaf blower or one of those cannons that they use to shoot T-shirts into the crowds at baseball games. Bring something like that and make sure the dearly departed gets launched a reasonable distance out there. Otherwise, if there's no wind, their remains might end up in your sandals, because that's what happened with my dad. For Minneapolis, Minnesota, where the introverts stare at their shoes and the extroverts stare at your shoes, I'm Tim Bedore for Vague But True.
Well, thank you, Tim. That was certainly an interesting story. I don't know if I'll get that image out of my head.
My pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Stand-Up Comedy, your host and MC. For information on the show, merchandise, and our sponsors, or to send comments to Scott, visit our website at www.standupyourhostandmc.com. Look for more episodes soon and enjoy the world of stand-up comedy. Visit a comedy showroom near you.